What's up, guys, and welcome back. I'm Ash, Master Level Instructor of Ely Chuen, the Martial Art of Awareness, and student of Grandmaster Sam Chin. We're back today with another interview in our ongoing series celebrating the unique insights, perspectives, and successes of other martial arts experts. Today's guest is Tim Cartmell. Tim is a renowned martial artist and author, known for his expertise in Chinese martial arts and achievements in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, with several influential books to his name and numerous championships in Jiu-Jitsu. He stands as a respected figure, bridging traditional and modern combat practices. Tim, welcome, and thanks for joining me today.
Well, thank you. Glad to be here.
So for people that may not be familiar with you, can you just give us a little bit more detail about your personal background and history with martial arts?
I started in Chinese martial arts style called Kung Fu San Soo when I was a boy, probably maybe 11 years old. And San Soo is kind of primarily a self-defense oriented style. So I practiced San Soo, must have been about 12 years. And then I moved to Taiwan. And I lived in Taiwan for about 11 years. And I practiced primarily the internal Chinese martial arts. And I competed in Sanda for a few years. And then I started to train in the mainland, primarily in Beijing. And then I moved back to the States in the mid-90s and started practicing Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. And then I practiced Brazilian, I'm still practicing Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and teaching. So I got my black belt in the early 2000s and competed in Jiu-Jitsu and submissions wrestling. And now I teach Jiu-Jitsu, I teach the traditional Chinese styles, and coach MMA fighters. It's my job.
So there's a lot to unpack there. So that it's just kind of a very casual, I just decided to move to Taiwan. Can you go into a little more detail on that?
Yeah, so it must have been, I was in the early 80s, I guess. I was getting out of college and I decided, I wanted to further my training. And like a lot of kind of young men of my generation, I'd read Robert Smith's books, like Masters and Methods, and I was very interested in going back to China to train, at the source kind of thing. So that was one of the main catalysts. And I'd literally never seen any of the internal styles done live. Maybe a Tai Chi demo or something when I was a kid. So I read a lot about it, and that intrigued me. So that was the main reason to go. So I went to Taiwan. I moved there. I got into the university, the language program at the Taiwan Normal University, and then I just moved over, and then looked for teachers and went from there. Started studying Chinese, and I was very fortunate actually, and I met people and I got introductions to teachers, and then that's how it went.
So you went to Taiwan specifically for internal martial arts.
Correct. Right.
So what was the motivation to transition from San Soo to move to another country to pursue internal martial arts?
The Sun Tzu is I mean, if you're gonna categorize, it's an external style, and I'd done it quite a while. It was great, but I just read a lot about internal. So there's something about that, the idea of like maximizing your body power, like that. There was a very detailed emphasis on body use and the intent and those kind of things. I was very interested in it because I felt like at a certain point, of course, your physicality has to be on point, right? So for martial arts, fighting fundamentally at its most basic is an athletic event. No matter what style you practice, it's an athletic event. So I trained really hard, and I felt like I had a pretty good handle on that. So it was I guess what we would now call the internal aspects of it that I felt like, and not that Sun Tzu didn't have those kind of things, but it seemed very, very developed in the internal style. So that was what intrigued me at first. So yeah, I didn't really have any ideas of developing kind of magic powers or anything either. Like there's a lot of hype around that, but they talked a lot about like mind body unity, the use of intent, some of the strategies they talked about, like the Bhagavad Gita strategy, and those things that somehow I found super appealing. So that was really and I trained in other things in Taiwan as well, but that was I just wanted to, there was really, now it'd be much easier. There's so much more information as well with the internet, and there's more teachers. But back then there weren't that many, weren't that many options, I guess. So that was, and also I wanted to travel. I originally thought I'd go maybe a couple, 3 years, and train, and then I got into it. I got in. I mean, I had a 5-year language program to start when I got there. So, and then after that, I just kept training and teaching. And then when I competed, it was a whole nother area that I really enjoyed.
So who did you primarily train with during your time in Taiwan?
I had quite a few teachers. So I trained with Xu Hongji in the his Shenlong Tang Shou Dao, primarily Xingyi method. And that was a great school because they were a fight school. So that's when I first got into like Sanda tournament. So the training was very, and again, I had no real idea how anyone trained. I'd never, I'd never seen like a Xingyi class or a Bagua group or anything before I went. So, I'd read about him in Inside Kung Fu and that kind of thing. So for me, it was a great choice. So there was a lot of conditioning, and then we did the traditional Xingyi, and then there was a lot of sparring, every class we sparred, and then we would compete. So that was a great foundation. And after I was only there, maybe 7, 8 months with Xiongji, he passed away, unfortunately. And then I spent the next 3 years with his son on it. So I trained in the same group with his son. And about that time too, maybe within a year of being there, I trained with the teacher, Chen Zuozhen, who done Hebei Xingyi and Chen Taiji, as well as these kind of obscure white crane styles. He was a Taiwanese guy. So I trained with him. He's a very, very good martial artist. And then Li Nalong is a Taiji master. And then I spent the last few years with Wu Dexiu practicing the Gao style Bagua. And in that time, I met Dan Miller, who he had the Bagua Journal back then. It was a really well-produced, well-researched magazine. And I met Dan in Taiwan, and he hired me as a translator, and I went to the mainland with him. And I met a lot of kind of famous, Northern Chinese martial artists. And I made a special connection with Liang Kechuan, who was a very well-known Xingyi Bagua master. So I started going to stay in Beijing with him and train. And then the last few years, I met Sun Jianyun, Sun Wutang's daughter. And she was the last teacher I had. I went back to train with her the last few years I was in Taiwan.
Yeah, I was going to ask you if that calligraphy on the wall was by Liang Kechuan.
No, this is actually Sun Jianyun. Sun Jianyun was probably the greatest living Bagua master. He passed away a few years ago, and I didn't train with him. I did a few private lessons with him, and but he was just like a fascinating character, and I would say the best Bagua practitioner alive up until he passed, and he was also like a master calligrapher. So I asked him. That's my favorite Tang poem. So I asked him to paint that for me, and also I have a Shangwu logo that I use in all my literature that he also painted for me. So that was Sun Jianyun.
Very cool. So let's go back a little bit. When you first went to Taiwan, I mean, when you showed up, did you already have a grasp of Mandarin at all? Or, I mean, did you show up not being able to speak the language? And, what was it like the first day that when you were introduced to Xu Hongji, like your first experience with the class?
So no, I couldn't speak any Chinese yet, and then I got there. I had a lot of introduction. I met Xu Hongji, who was interested. I might have told this story before, but it was like a old school kung fu movie. Like I met him, and he was like, "Well, I don't really teach new students anymore," and that kind of thing. But then he said, he taught, or he used to work out at Yuanshan, is a mountain right outside Taipei. So he said, I go up there with my friends in the morning, He goes, you can come up though and exercise. So every morning, really early, I would go to Yuan Shan and I climb up to where he had this little group. And uh, after a few days, he said there was Fang Lasher, this other teacher I think he did White Crane. I can't remember, one of his friends. He goes, you can learn basic exercises with him. So I trained with him, and for maybe a month or so, I came every morning and I did the exercises. And then one day, Xiongji said, "Here, come here," and then he put me in Santi, like the standing posture. And then he told me a few things about it. He said, "Just stand there." And I just stood there. It seemed like forever, and that went on for a bit. And then one day he said, "This is P-Trend," and he showed me the first form. That's how it started. And then, again, after he passed away, I continued. I met his son in the interim, and then after that, I started training with his son. So that was literally how I started my practice.
Okay. So when you said that that group, um, they put a lot of emphasis on strength and conditioning. Am I correct in remembering that the Fu Hu Gong is one of their main sets? What else did it look like? The overall conditioning program.
So when I trained with Xiongji, it was privately on Yuan Shan, and then he taught in a couple universities, like clubs, like college kids had food industries. At school was one. They had college clubs. Kids did it as an extracurricular activity. So he taught in a couple places, and then he also had classes at their old academy in Taipei. So that was the first time I was in a class setting, and the classes were long, almost 3 hours long. He had them about 3 days a week in his school, and it was we would start with like warm ups, and then the Fu Hu Gong we did every class. So Fu Hu Gong is kind of a combination of a lot of judo exercises from judo that Xiongji and those guys had learned when they were kids. And like we shrimped on the ground and did all these things that later on when I did jiu-jitsu, I was like, I've done this. At the time I had no idea, we just did it as conditioning. There were lots of push-up variations, squat variations, and ab work and things. And then that would go on for, I want to say, an hour. We did jump kicks, like just conditioning basically. And then we would stand in Santi, and then we would do forms, and then they would show whatever technique, and then we would spar. And that was kind of the breakdown of the classes. Yeah.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So Luo de Shu, I'm familiar with as well. I have a training brother that also Bernie Langen.
And
He also trains with Luo. But there was a third teacher that you mentioned. That his name I wasn't familiar with. Can you repeat that again?
so Chen Zhuozhen was one of my early teachers, and he grew up in Shiguo, like in the middle of the island where White Crane is popular. So that teacher grew up doing this kind of soft style of White Crane. There's various kinds of Southern Crane styles, and then when he was young, he started to train with Cao Lianfang, this famous Xingyi Tai Chi master from the mainland, and he trained with him kind of from I guess through his teens until he was grown up. And so I practiced with him probably 5 years. So it was Hebei Xingyi and Yang Taiji. He did the older kind of medium frame version of the Yang style. So I practiced with him about 5 years. So also fairly well-known martial artist in Taiwan. So that was also, he was a pretty big influence on me early on as well.
So, and then you said that you met Dan Miller. So was it meeting Dan that primarily prompted you to move to the mainland?
So I traveled there a couple times at that point, just traveled around, but I really didn't, I didn't look for martial arts actually. I just gone to travel. And then so Dan came, and he was looking for a translator. Yeah, so I went around Taiwan, and then we went to Beijing, and Dan had already had an in with a lot of kind of big name Chinese martial arts teachers through his connections, and that's when I met. That was the time. Once I met the teachers, I decided now I want to come and to go to the mainland and train. That was after I met Dan.
And then you said you spent how long on the mainland?
So I stayed the longest I would stay for a lot of times, a couple months at a time. Then I'd go back and work in Taiwan, and train. And I had students there as well. And then after a few months, I'd go back again. So, I mean, cumulatively, I don't know how long. But
Okay,
for
so it was
three,
more of intermittent. It wasn't
I
a
admit,
steady
I
period.
go right a couple times a year for a couple months for about, I guess, 5 years maybe. I did that.
Okay. Um, so let's switch gears a little bit, and can you tell us more about your introduction to and then transition into the world of jiu-jitsu?
Um, yeah, interestingly enough, I'd come back to the States. I think it was a Christmas, probably in must have been about 91 or something, I guess. And I was in a bookstore looking through like a black belt magazine. And in the back of the magazine, those little ads, there was a little ad that said Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, like film of real fights. And I was like, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu? Like there's no such thing as, what's Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu? And it said real fights. So I bought it. I wanted to see real fight because, I had a picture of like a fight. I said, I'll buy that. So it was the Gracie in Action 1 tape. So I bought it and I watched it. And uh, I'd had a little bit of wrestling experience, right? But I was fully aware that from experience that fights will go to the ground. Most fights will end up on the ground. And I really liked the whole idea. So, the idea of they'd taken kind of pre-war judo and developed it, and they kept the actual self-defense fighting aspect of it rather than, being all sportive. So right then I was like, I need to learn something. So I interesting story. I have an old friend. He now is a jiu-jitsu teacher in Texas. An old friend of mine, and I grew up. He's a little bit older. He did San Soo. I knew him, my whole childhood, and he was like a bouncer. He's a really tough guy, big, strong guy. Really good fighter. And I showed him the video. I was back visiting. I said, "You got to see this," and he was like, "Ah, those guys would be able to take me down," kind of thing. So after I went back to Taiwan, he went and did the Gracie Challenge. He went to the Gracie Academy in Torrance, and he said, "Yeah, I want to fight you guys." And he's a big, strong guy, so they sent out Rickson Gracie. And it was interesting. He told me, he goes, I took one look at Rickson, and I knew I was in trouble. But he said, I in my wildest dreams, I had no idea how fast I would lose. So Rickson just took him out and choked him unconscious, and he just woke up and signed up basically. So but I came back the next year and he was already a blue belt jiu-jitsu. So I went and trained with him, and he was training in San Diego with a teacher called Nelson Monteiro, who started the whole Abu Dhabi thing, the Abu Dhabi Fight Club, ADCC. So I went down and trained. I had a few lessons, and I was really impressed with the stuff. And then I went back to Taiwan, and then that year the UFC happened, and I was in New York at the time, and we went to watch it, and we all bet who would win. And I said, the skinny Brazilian kid's going to win. And everyone laughed at me because they didn't know. And I said, no, you guys don't get it. And then after he won, that was kind of the beginning of the explosion. So when I came back to California in probably the end of 94, there were a lot of, not like now, but there were a lot of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu academies. Because after the UFC, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu blew up. And, a lot of really good Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu instructors, they came to California primarily because the weather was nice and they could surf, So when I came back, that's when I started. So, I trained with one Rickson Gracie students, and then, I found some other teachers. I ended up eventually with my long-term teacher, Clever Luciano, where I got my black belt. And then it was another avenue also for me to compete. So, I started to compete in jiu-jitsu, submissions wrestling, and some amateur MMA. And then I went pro a couple years in submissions grappling, but it was in my mid 40s, and it was hard to condition that hard to fight with they're all much, much younger. It was a really good experience for me. And then I just kept going through jiu-jitsu. And then eventually I combined what I'd learned, in the Chinese martial arts with the jiu-jitsu, and I boxed some, and I started teaching MMA classes. So that was probably in the early 2000s. And then when I eventually closed my school and I moved to where I am now, Ace Jiu-Jitsu, I just continue with it. So I primarily teach jiu-jitsu, submissions, and then I coach MMA fighters.
So, um, let me ask you a two-part question. First part is, what do you think that like the world of jiu-jitsu and MMA can learn from the traditional Chinese martial arts, and then vice versa?
So MMA is interesting. They'll learn anything from anyone as long as you can prove it works. So that's the big caveat. I think sometimes because I'm in both worlds, and I'm in primarily the kind of jiu-jitsu MMA world, and people think MMA fighters are arrogant. They think they know it. They don't. They're exactly the opposite of that. If you could prove that you have something they don't have that will help them win a fight, they will learn it from you, right? That's why it's mixed martial arts. So the martial arts that end up being primarily the foundations of MMA, you'll notice a couple things about them. They're all traditional originally, right? Um, but they are all sports. And the thing about combat sports are you have to do them for real against other trained people, like daily. And this is the most important thing that everyone should learn if they want to learn how to actually fight. So the problem with a lot of the traditional styles are they either have the I'm too deadly to spar nonsense, or the, you know, somehow I'll just do forms and be able to fight kind of weird ideas. If you don't practice fighting as close as possible to fighting, you won't be able to really fight. Now, you might develop some basic skills and do a little better than you would have, but you're not going to be a fighter. So this is a lot of and I repeat this all the time. A lot of times, then people denigrate kind of traditional arts. They're like, well, they don't work. It's not they work or they don't work. It's the training methodology that makes all the difference. So if you say, for example, if you went to a boxing gym, I don't think anyone's going to disagree that if you're going to stand in front of a guy who can box, he's going to punch you in the head. He's going to know how to do it, right? He can really box. He can fight. But imagine if you went to a boxing gym and all you did was jump rope and hit a heavy bag. You can't box. This is the problem. A lot of Chinese styles or traditional styles in general, they do basics really good. They condition, they stand in stances, they do forms, they maybe do techniques kind of cooperatively, and they expect that to teach them how to fight, and it will not. It will not take you past a basic level. So if anyone's going to learn anything from anyone, everyone should understand that you need to be sparring against 100% resistance, and there has to be an element of randomness. And there's a whole art to learning how to spar. The other way around, if there's a lot of, although a lot of these things that you wouldn't think would be part of MMA training there's a lot of mental training. Some of the things from internal, technically, strategically, you have to modify things for the venue, right? So if you're talking about fighting in a ring, if you're talking about self-defense, the primary goal is to escape unscathed, right? So if you're in a street fight, quote unquote, and someone swings at you and you duck and run, you won the fight. Obviously, you can't do that in a cage, right? You have to finish the fight. So you need to either knock someone unconscious or choke them unconscious, make them tap because you're about to break a joint, right? Or beat them up so bad they can't continue. That's the goal. So the techniques that work are the techniques that work. The same techniques that work in a sport fight are the ones that are going to work in a street fight. There are no magic street fight techniques. The strategy will change, of course, depending on the venue. So a cage fight or a mat fight is not a street fight. So those things have to be modified either direction. So say you're a traditional martial artist and you want to compete in MMA, you got to understand the goal and modify your strategy around that. The one thing I feel like an MMA fighter might want to take away from a lot of traditional styles is the self-defense mindset. Now, I've never met a competent MMA fighter that's not just going to dominate just about any street fight scenario you could possibly put them into, because they can really fight. Having said that, though, there needs to be an awareness of environment or potential weapons and those kind of things that you don't train for in MMA, because no one's going to pull a knife in a cage, or no one's going to, your environment is surrounded by a cage, right? So, you want to extrapolate out. And a lot of the kind of awareness things we did with the when I did internal, a lot of those things I feel, if you're going to talk about being kind of a well-rounded, you can sport fight and you're ready for an actual self-defense situation, a lot of those kind of concepts, and we had specific training drills for that. That would be beneficial to someone who did something like MMA. Now, if you're an MMA fighter and you just like, what, I'm not going to get in a street fight, or if I do, I'll just punch and kick the guy and take him down. fine, you don't need to do it. Just like if you do some kind of traditional style for health, it's totally legit. If you say, listen, I don't care if I can even defend myself. I like doing style X. You know, I like the discipline of it. I like the camaraderie. I like the tradition. I like the coordinating my mind and body. I don't really care if I could fight or not. Fine, that's fine too. You just have to be clear on your goal.
Right. Um, so is there anything from, well, actually, let me, before I go in that direction, do you feel that your time with the traditional Chinese martial arts, like any of that, did that any of that carry over to your jiu-jitsu practice? Did it help? Did it hinder?
Well, absolutely. So the one thing about, uh, first of all, it established a discipline when I did it when I practiced Chinese martial arts, right? It established a discipline. Secondly, the heavy emphasis on mind-body unity and connecting and like being cognizant of your movement and being aware. Not that it's not in something like jujitsu, but I already had I didn't have to spend a lot of time in the beginning figuring that out too. You know what I mean? Along with the technical kind of training. So that was a big help. And then, yeah, a lot. I tell you, a lot of the things like the what we would call when I did Tai Chi, we'd call freestyle push hands. We in English we'd call it wrestling, right? We just wrestled. So a lot of those body sensitivity skills, they're in wrestling as well. I already had a strong foundation in them, and then some of the throws. I already knew how to execute throws. A lot of the throws in the Bhagavad throws are fundamentally throws, right? And their methods of entry and the body use and things I felt like were very useful. The things I got, I mean, the ground fighting was non-existent really. There's really, the internal styles. So all that technically was new. And it was frustrating for me at first for the first couple of years too, because when I learned, we did a lot of judo training and stand up. And when I boxed, it was like, because I'd done so much stand up, it seemed a lot easier to adapt. And on the ground, I really, I was in good shape, but I understood intellectually that the same principles must apply, but I couldn't apply them. Took years of just grappling before I could see the direct connection. That's what I try to convey now when I teach in seminars, is kind of the universal principles of use and application that apply standing and on the ground. But that took a while. I was probably several years into my jiu-jitsu training before that started to really coalesce. But yeah, a lot of the um, again, the mind body unity, the body sensitivity, and those things carried over. The one thing that being in the jiu-jitsu and standing grappling and then doing all the MMA kind of training did was, it's like sparring's a laboratory for what you can really do, right? It doesn't matter what you can do on a compliant opponent. I can get anyone off the street and teach them how to throw you in 5 minutes. Why couldn't they do it for real? Well, you wouldn't let them, right? So you learn, of course, on a compliant opponent, but then the levels of resistance must be gradually and consistently elevated. That's the only way to learn how to do it live. And obviously, if you box, you do jiu-jitsu MMA, you're sparring in every single class. I mean, there's, half the class will be live sparring. And that gave me a lot of time and opportunity to test out things that I learned previously, to see what worked and what didn't for me, right? And it also doesn't matter what your teacher can do or your classmates at the same belt level can do. It's what you can really do. And the only way to find out how to do that is to spar against, various opponents. So yeah, I felt like it's a big help. I don't feel like there's really any hindrance from doing any of the Chinese styles. No, it was just, they were incomplete and there was no ground fighting. And like when I was in Taiwan, like in Ji school, for example, or One school, there was a lot of sparring as well. But other teachers that I had that were very good, that I learned like very valuable things from, there was no real sparring. And, I do it on the side kind of thing. But that would have been, if you only train that way, you're really not going to learn to fight.
How much of what you learned from your time in Taiwan and China do you still practice regularly? Like, what elements do you make part of your personal practice?
So the body use that I learned, right? There's certain alignments and like ways to coordinate your body. That's in everything. That's because that's where I understand it. And again, not that it's not in other styles, right? It's just that's where I learned it. So that's how I understand it. And there are some unique kind of um, training methods that I still use, but like I don't really do forms very often and that kind of thing. I feel like they were valuable at the time, and I got out of them, what I felt like I could get out of them. So I'm talking about like link long formal forms kind of thing. I teach them because I feel like they're valuable in those systems. So basically, no matter what you do, in my opinion, is a form. It's a kata. Like you should always be paying attention to your alignment, your relationship with gravity, your breathing, your coordination. So I do a lot of. If you watch my workouts, my solo workouts, it would maybe look like conditioning. You'd say like, well, like I do a lot of inversion work, like handstand work. I do a lot of ground exercises from jiu-jitsu. I practiced yoga with my first teacher for 12 years as well. So that was a big influence on my solo training. But in my mind, it's just they're all forms. So they're all kata. There's no just now I'm just doing push-ups kind of idea. Everything I do, I try to do uh, with those elements in place. So that's from the Chinese martial arts, right? It's kind of indistinguishable. I don't really separate. I would separate things into styles to teach them because that's how I learned them, and it's convenient because humans like that kind of thing. Our brain works good with that kind of organization. But it's kind of like, you know, if somebody can throw a hard front kick and they kick you in the face, can you tell what style it's from? I think not. If you generate force correctly, right? So the beauty of the style idea is they're strategically going to be different. So it's easy to organize your training around certain um, kind of like uh, what's the word strategies, I guess. You know what I mean? So and that helps because they were developed by people who understood those strategies, and then you can combine them however you'd like. So those things are all in play. A lot of the ways like the distance management I use when I'm doing stand up, I've learned all that from the internal styles. And again, not that it's not in other styles. I'm not saying it's exclusive, but they have a really precise method of conveying it and really well developed drilling systems as well. So all that would be included.
How much, well, before I get off on another topic, let me ask you another follow-up question. How about any of the more esoteric stuff that you learned from training with those guys? Any specific, Qigong? Do you still do any kind of Jamjong or Santi, anything like that as part of your personal practice? Would you teach that to somebody now? Like, let's just say somebody came to you that they never heard of MMA, they never heard of BJJ, they never heard of the Chinese martial arts. They just want to learn, how to fight or how to train. Like, what would you, how would you approach teaching them based on having such a broad base of experience?
So I have a method broken down. One that I teach a lot is ground proofing. I teach it. I've taught it to police departments. I taught some of it in Europe this time. I teach it. Um, for example, it's grappling self-defense for non-grapplers. You know what I mean? So, and I have a stand-up proofing. So if you came to me and said, Tim, I just want to learn how to defend myself. I'm not going to train long-term. I'm not going to compete. I don't, you know what I mean? I have a few months to train. What would you teach me? That's the way I'd go. There'd be no qigong and zhanzhuang, and it'd be for them a waste of time. So we would talk about posture and alignment, mind body unity. With those like body use would be in the curriculum, but it would be a minimum number of basic kind of movement exercises that would develop just basic power for those skills. And then it would just start with distance management, how to defend against blows, how to get out of standing holds, how to fall, how to get up off the ground, how to escape a few basic holds on the ground. You'd be done. That anything other than that is going to now require a long-term commitment to being a martial artist, right? So if you came to me and said, I want to learn how to fight, I said, well, we're going to stand in the stance for 6 months. You could be competent at defending yourself in way less time than that. That would be a waste of their time. If you came to me and said, I want to learn Xing Yi Chuan as the traditional style, we would start with standing because it's integral to the whole method, right? So that's a hard question to answer. If for my MMA fighters, would standing like for long periods of time really help them? I don't think so. They have enough training that covers what they need to do. Is it Would it help them if they had time? Maybe, yeah. might increase the mind body unity. So you're talking about the goal of the training and the specific systems, right? So but if you came to me and said, Tim, I want to learn some of these things for health and exercise, for just health benefits, I would definitely teach them to stand a little bit. Yeah. So it depends on people's goals and their purpose for training. So I just explained this on my friend Ed Hines podcast. They were asking about John Zhuang. I feel like I practiced E-Trend for several years in Taiwan as well. I feel like John Zhuang type training is extremely valuable in their systems. Like there's a way more benefit to them than I think most people realize, because most people look for the esoteric. Just from the practical kind of bodybuilding, being able to stabilize your frame training, testing your will, coordinating your mind. It's fantastic training. And it's great training in those systems. But having said that, the very best fighters in the world have never heard of John Zhuang. So how much would you think it would help? It depends on what your goal is. Yeah. So self-defense, I teach them how to fight. We want to learn a traditional style. They can learn how to fight within that method. If you said to me, I want to learn Xing Yi Quan, and you practiced it and you got really good at it, you could be a very competent stand-up fighter. You still can't ground fight. You know what I mean? It depends on how you want to break it down. You said, I want to do sport jiu-jitsu on the ground only. You're not going to be able to fight standing up either.
So what about, is there any type of Qigong or even just breath work that you practice regularly just as part of your recovery, or just to help modulate your mental state, your state of awareness, as far as like being able to key up or key down as needed?
Yeah, the breath is incorporated. My breath work is incorporated into kind of everything that I would do. You know what I mean? Like the breathing that I learned. I don't. Can I have 1 second? My dog's crying. Hang on 1 second.
Yeah, go ahead. No worries.
Anyway, yeah, my dog's over there crying at the door. So the breath work is incorporated into the training, and I do some kind of post-training recovery stationary breath training. When I was growing up doing the yoga, we did a lot of the pranayama, the different breathing exercises. I don't really do as much of that anymore. So, but there's like fundamental breathing patterns that I use, and also in the jiu-jitsu, especially I trained with Rickson Gracie for a couple of years, and Rickson's big on kind of yogic breathing and other things. So the ones I learned from him were competition oriented, like how you get your wind back when you're in the middle of a match or something like that, right? And those things I use when I grapple.
Okay. Yeah. So there was a clip that was shared recently of one of your workshops in Paris, I believe. And one of the things that stood out to me was you had made a comment that the whole point of Tai Chi is to get your opponent on one foot. So I was wondering if you could go into more detail on that. Was that a comment that you made specific to the context of that scenario, what you guys were working on, or do you mean that more broadly? And how much of that point of view has been influenced now by your time in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu?
Yeah, so I can't remember exactly what I said, but obviously it's more to Tai Chi than putting someone on one foot. I was talking at the time, we were talking about the internal methods for throwing, right? So, and it's more complicated than that, but if you want to kind of condense down the whole idea of Tai Chi training, Tai Chi is very, very interesting in that, like if you ever read Sun Wukong's book, he talks about Tai Chi. One of the big benefits of practicing Tai Chi is you can learn to fight very quickly, because the technique base is limited and the method is very obviously straightforward, which nowadays seems to be, exactly the opposite. Or if you read Chen Weimin's book that he wrote for Yang Chengfu, right? Chen Weimin, this is in I think the early 30s. He says, everybody knows Tai Chi is a great fighting style, but very few people know it's good for health. So you can kind of see how things have changed. So the basic Tai Chi strategy is, and you hear it in English all the time. So in Chinese, they say Qi Fang. Qi means to lift up, Fang means to put down, right? And then all the other aspects of it, John Lee and Yen Sui, like sticking, following, they talk about don't let go, don't resist. All these things are to help you do that. So T is also often referred to as bagun. Bagun is to literally uproot, pull up their root, right? So in Tai Chi, they talk about you want to uproot and then you can project someone or throw them down or hit them. So I'm not sure how other people would define uproot, but my teachers, it's very simple. And for people listening, if you think about this for a little bit, and then next time you're wrestling stand up, you're sparring, like keep it in mind. So what does uproot mean? That's a simple question. Like if I ask you, if I said, well, you've done Tai Chi, you need to uproot your opponent. What does it mean? And then, you get different answers. My teachers taught me uprooting is to shift their weight onto one of their feet, one leg. So I'd explain it this way. If you're standing on both feet, right? So I talk a lot about, and I use the Chinese term transitive dead angles a lot. I wrote about it a lot. The dead angles are like a really important basic concept if you want to move someone's mass, to throw them or whatever.
Yeah, before I lost my entire personal library in 2015. But in my original library, I had a copy of your effortless combat throws, and I remember you writing about the dead angle there.
Right. So the dead angle is the angle at which, if you apply force toward that angle, that the opponent can't resist without adjusting. So if you're standing in a horse stance, a parallel stance, obviously, straight forward and straight back, you're dead angle. So you draw a line between someone's inner ankles and you find the midpoint and go 90 degrees, that's their dead angle. So it's, people know this, obviously. Even a kid, if you wanted to shove someone over, would push them straight back. So when someone's standing on 2 feet, they have 2 dead angles. When you push their weight into 1 foot, if you're talking about a circle around, they have 360 dead angles, or an infinite number of dead angles. Any angle you push them to, they'd have no base, right? So if you put their weight on 1 foot, all you have to figure out is which way can I throw them so they can't put their other foot down. That's how Tai Chi works. So, I wish it was more exotic, but that's fundamentally how it works. And this is why, right? This is why people can get good at it very relatively quickly and actually apply it for real. So that's what I was talking about. That was the kind of, and it got kind of, morphed into, Tim says, the whole thing about Tai, it's like, I'm just talking about that mechanic, right? There's a lot to Tai Chi. Sticking,
Right.
following, not letting others, but those things, the goal, you have strategy and tactics, right? So your tactic is to stick and follow, keep them from controlling your center, control their center, and get their weight onto 1 foot, and then you complete the technique. So my Tai Chi teacher used to say, like, in Tai Chi there's only one, not two, and what he meant was, if you can use the word fajing if you want, like you want to issue your force only once and win the fight. And win the fight to them is, you project the person or throw them down or knock them down. So it's not that you should be applying force over and over. And that doesn't mean no force, but before you kind of like you keep aiming your gun until you have the red dot right in their forehead, then you would pull the trigger, kind of thing. So everything before that is kind of like a push hands, right? You're going to use your body sensitivity. You're going to kind of be hand fighting like in wrestling until you can connect from a spirit position. Once you have a spirit connection, you can bring them onto 1 foot, and then you issue your major force and the guy falls down. That's basically Tai Chi, right? So that's the idea of uprooting.
Yeah, there's a lot of interesting things there. I like the insight about how can you throw them in such a way that they can't put their other foot back down. That's an interesting way to look at it. So as we're coming up on the end of our time here, one thing that I always like to ask all my guests is, what's besides your own, what's a book that you have gifted most often to other martial arts, either friends or students? It doesn't have to be a martial arts book, but just something that you think is going to help people on their way.
Well, I mean, it would depend on what their interest is, right? Um, uh, Martial arts, for people who want to understand Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and how it works, and kind of the background is John Danaher and Renzo Gracie's book, Mastering Jiu-Jitsu. It's light on technique and heavy on theory. So a lot of times people, talk to me, have a million questions, are confused. You could read that book and understand the whole idea of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. I feel like that's good for Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. Um, as far as, of course, I've been saying this now. Now it's actually, I read it online a lot, but I started saying this probably 25 years ago. If you can get a copy, and it's public domain, of Jack Dempsey's championship fighting book, you
Yeah.
want to understand Shingi, a basic idea of things like Shingi trends, body mechanics. That's probably the go-to. Again, I had people after I said that message me and go, Tim, Jack Dempsey never did Shingi. It's like, yeah, of course. Yeah, I'm talking about how he generates force, the way he explains it, right? That book is probably the best book you could read. And then, I mean, other than that, I don't know. It would depend on someone's whatever their interest was.
All right. Yeah, it's surprising how many times that Jack Dempsey's book Championship Fighting comes up, and of course, I've read it myself, and I mean, it's a real small book. It's just cuts right to the core. It's a great book. So, if people are interested in following up with you, what kind of projects do you have coming up? Do you have any books in the work now? What's your workshop schedule look like, and how can people find out where to follow what you've got going on?
Yeah, I'm not writing anything now. So my travel near the end of the year, so mostly done. I have a couple more seminars. I'll be in Dayton, Ohio, and Cleveland. I have the dates actually here. Um, I'll be in Portland, uh, December 5th if you're in the Portland area. These are jiu-jitsu seminars. In Ohio, I teach Shingi and Bagua primarily. And that's about the rest of the year. And then, I don't really have a very organized, uh, usually have to find the guys who are promoting it to find out about it. Yeah, I usually don't market. I don't do any marketing really on my own. So that's hard too. Or you can contact me directly and I can give people my website, or my email address is Shunwu, SHENWU, one word, at verizon.net. So if anyone's interested in training or actual dates for the seminars, they can contact me there.
Well, you must be doing something right because, I mean, if you've done, Chinese martial arts for a while, you've definitely heard the name Tim Cartmell. But I have noticed that you just kind of fly under the wire. You're not really active in promoting yourself, but you seem to be staying plenty busy. So that's
Yeah,
a sign that you're doing something right.
yeah, good.
All right, well, we'll wrap that one up for today. Tim, thanks for joining me. I really appreciate your time. Hopefully, I can get over to LA when you're around and we can meet in person. As we have a couple of people like all in the same orbit, but haven't had a chance to meet you in person yet. And I'm
All
really
good.
grateful for your time and your point of view.
Thanks, Ash.